It is an extraordinary pleasure. And I don't say or use these words easily. When I say them, I mean them. To introduce my viewers, which I'm told are now rising to 1 million. I hope I can believe that because I haven't seen that figure yet. It appears as if some people just appear for a minute or so, and that is considered to be participation. Be that as it may, it is a pleasure then to introduce Neil Roberts and Paget Henry, and not necessarily in that lexical order, because one is older than the other. To African Ascent, they need no introduction at this stage. They have appeared in African Ascent at least 3-4 times. I consider them, along with Cornel West, to be the pillars of African Ascent. Paget Henry is the author of Caliban's Reason, that have been known to describe as the Bible of the Caribbean world. He is also, along with the great Louis Gordon, founder of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, as well as a fact that I always fail to mention, an editor of the leading Black journal in the country, the CLR James Journal, that you should check out. And of course, last but not least, professor par excellence at Brown University, in which he teaches in 2 prestigious departments: Africana Studies itself, a department that I consider is relevant. It does relevant work, and sociology. Neil Roberts, whom I describe as young. I've known him ever since he was 25 years old. Paget, remember when we were coaching this young scholar? Look at him now, he's gone beyond us. He's not only the chair of Africana Studies at Williams College, nor is he the leading scholar on Frederick Douglass, but most importantly, his last work, with a very enticing title that I enjoy saying repeatedly, Marronage, which is a distillation for fighting back and action, or an exercise in resistance, resistance by the oppressed, by the exploited, who, as Bob Marley famously said, stand up and fight for your rights. He will give us the philosophical grounding of this particular practice that the exploited and the oppressed across the world, or whom Fanon called the rich of the earth, have been willfully engaging. So today's episode is going to cover thematics that we did not cover in the 2 episodes prior to that. In the first one, we diagnosed the condition of the death of George Floyd through this public lynching. And both Neil Roberts and Paget Henry gave a penetrating dissection of the conditions under which this public lynching took place, which took us to a second episode, which was singularly presented by Paget Henry himself, in which he gave us a substantive, from what my viewers are saying, and truly intelligent analysis of the crisis of the neoliberal project. Today's episode then returns to 2 themes that have asked these scholars to carve out and present differently through their own vocabularies and languages. Paget Henry is going to articulate a vision of what could be done now that the human condition is on the precipice, as it were, of self-destruction. So he will share with us his well thought out lineaments of how we can save the world, with Black Lives Matter at the centerpiece of that vision. Neil Roberts is going to draw from his last book, which is becoming increasingly famous, namely this book on marronage, on actionality, on resistance. And through it, he too is going to participate in articulating a vision of what, as Lenin would have said, what must be done. Let me begin with Professor Paget Henry. Welcome to African Ascent, your own television program, Professor Paget Henry, at the pillar of African Ascent.
Thank you, Brother Theodros. It's good to be back with you. And of course, Neil, always good to be back with you. Okay. I want to, in fact, I suggested last time that this George Floyd insurrection has erupted at the ending of the neoliberal era. That I see the neoliberal era as right now being in very steep decline. And the George Floyd insurrection erupted at this point because the neoliberal era, era carried within it a neo-Jim Crow project, of mass incarceration as a response to its unemployment problems. So we had this very unique combination of class and race domination. And the neo-Jim Crow project, very interestingly, of course, was masked behind the ideology of America in a colorblind period, right? And to me, this peculiar combination of a very oppressive neoliberal project, supported by this neo-racist Jim Crow type project, certainly reversed many of the achievements of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and blocked the completing of many of its unfinished projects. So I see the civil rights movement as an incomplete movement, a movement that did not get the opportunity to fulfill its vision. It was forced backward prematurely. Thus, going forward, we have to talk about neoliberal order and what's beyond it. In other words, a post-neoliberal order in politics, in economics, race, and gender relations. Right? Now, I think the first step in moving forward is for us to stand resolutely and very strongly behind the Black Lives Matter movement and this insurrectionary phase that it is now in. These in-the-street insurrectionary practices is the power base of this movement. We must not let it demobilize prematurely. Let us not forget, it took 43,000 National Guard troops supporting state and local police in 31 states to contain the insurrectionary potential of this movement. That's the power that we've got. And that's the power that we need to preserve, mobilize, if we are going to change society. If we let it demobilize prematurely, right, then we're only going to lose the power that we have to go forward, right? This is the basis upon which we can talk about moving forward, right? It is the power of this movement that has constituted the flood that has brought down statues, that has reorganized police departments, or has gotten people started reorganizing police departments, Uh, this is the movement that has created new bonds of political solidarity between blacks and whites. We look at the nature of the demonstrations, and we can see something new arising there. And this is the movement that has given us our first Black female vice president-elect, right? And this is a movement that has opened up the spaces in which we are having these discussions, in which we are thinking new thoughts and embracing new possibilities. So the first step in moving forward must be to keep this mobilization going. It is the basis upon which everything rests. Right? It is the source of our power. And again, why I think this is so important, because if we go back to the civil rights movement, we see the way in which this kind of insurrectionary activity among African Americans has also the power to unleash other liberation movements. That the women's movement, right, has consistently gained a lot of strength, mobility, and momentum when African Americans have been in protest. When we look at the origins of the suffragist movement, right, it's inseparable from the movement to end slavery, right? So I think that there's something very special about Black insurrectionary periods. They generate a unique amount of power, very precious, and definitely should not be wasted. And it is incumbent upon us to preserve this insurrectionary moment, right? As long as we can. It is the base of everything that we're going to be doing moving forward. So, assuming we keep this momentum, and that this momentum will be the flood that will push a lot of things forward, right? I think we need to have some very clear political, economic, and racial demands. So let me talk a little bit about my political demands, then I'll give Neil a chance, and then I'll come back after Neil and talk about my economic demands.
I like it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Good structure. You're a good professor.
Okay, glad you like it. All right. The first major political demand that must be on our agenda is a post-neoliberal Democratic Party that we have to help to articulate, right, what that would look like, what it is we would want from a Biden-Harris administration and their leadership of the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party has been neoliberal. They bought onto the neoliberal project ever since Bill Clinton. And consequently, we have to admit the fact that Biden and Harris, right, are rooted in this. They're an integral part of it, right? They too have participated in turning America to the right. So the challenge that we need to put before them is indeed to reverse that. That moment when Bill Clinton started calling himself not a liberal Democrat, but a conservative Democrat. We need to take them back to that moment and let them know that they made a wrong turn. And the time has come, given this mass mobilization, right, to reverse that. We want you to stand up for the liberal principles that you've always stood for. the fact that President Trump described Harris, hoping, and this was, in his view, a negative thing, that she was the most liberal person in the Democratic Party. That's how he described it. Right? And nobody, called him to task for that. It tells you something about where Democrats stand today about being called liberals. So the first thing they've got to do is clean up the meaning of the word liberal. It's got to be something they wear with pride once again. That you want a clear distinction between the neoliberalism of the past 40 years and a genuine liberal democratic center going forward. That, I think, should be our major demand of the Biden-Harris administration. We cannot ask them to carry out a left agenda, right? They haven't said anything of a leftist nature, right? So to demand that they come and join this mass movement with all of these leftist leanings and sentiments, I think would be unrealistic. But I think it would be a reasonable demand to place before them that they really return the country to the kind of centrist liberal politics, an arena, political arena in which people can proudly say, I am a liberal. I stand for liberalism. What it meant, you see. And not always trying to, be as close to this conservative democracy that Clinton started. That's not going to work in this era. We need something post that. That was the adaptation of the Democratic Party during the neoliberal era. We want that gone, right? And we have to make that very, very clear. We preferred you when your face was genuinely liberal, right? This neoliberal stuff we don't like. We know that it wasn't always your roots, your face, your ideals. Let us make it clear to them that we preferred, the previous instantiation of the Democratic Party, right? So anything that's going to go left, any kind of left politics beyond that has to be our work. We have to take the responsibility for that. We cannot make it the responsibility of people who have never said anything beyond a centrist liberalism, right? So it's very important that we stay mobilized, remembering where our strength comes from, right? This is our power base, right? It is this power, right, that has been unleashed that is even making us think these thoughts. It has opened up new spaces, right? And it has opened up spaces very far to the left. So it's possible to put a left agenda together, but that has got to be our responsibility and not the Biden Harris responsibility. We need to address the Bernie Sanders group and other more progressive and activist groupings, and just see how far this movement can take us. So that's the political direction in which I would like to see us move. These are some of the things that we should be thinking about. And as far as the Republican Party goes, wow, I mean, the only thing I can say is authoritarian executive overreach approaches neo-fascism closer and closer every day. This stuff with the post office, manipulating the post office, is just so shocking and shameful. And it tells you and makes very clear the attitude towards the judiciary, the intelligence communities, all of these independent branches of government are being infiltrated, manipulated, as it would be in a fascist country. So we got to call out the Republican Party on this fascism. Let them know we don't like it, we won't stand for it, right? It is reprehensible and objectionable, right?
Before I move to Neil Roberts, let me linger a bit with you, Paget. I wonder if it would be apt to make distinctions between what I would like to call moderate centrist liberalism and radical liberalism, and what the differences might be. Because the centrist moderate liberalism, I think, functions in the absence of a support coming from the ground, if I understand your thinking. Whereas the radical liberalism gains its radicality precisely because it wants to engage, to draw in the people on the ground, to at least give the party aspirations, visions, hopes and dreams that the new party that you're calling for would take into account, or to put it differently, that party becomes a new party by virtue of the fact that it gets data from the social movements themselves. I wonder if these distinctions make sense to you.
Absolutely. And those distinctions become real and politically significant depending on how much strength, mobility, and momentum we are able to retain in the base. Now, let's face it, the sort of moderate center that you're talking about, at one point, that moderate center was Clinton, right? And he was prepared to make that compromise, to stop calling himself. I mean, Clinton campaigned as a liberal. I can see him with his saxophone blowing, in that first campaign of his. And liberalism was all over his campaign. And within 6-7 months of being president, he starts calling himself a conservative Democrat, right? So that center is what I'm saying is movable. And it's movable depending on how strong, you say, the pressure from the base, it remains mobilized. So right now, you can see people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and others kind of edging back, right, to a kind of center liberalism that's being responsive to the pressure from below. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. We can impact the party if we remain mobilized. How far we can influence them is going to depend upon how strongly we remain mobilized.
Okay.
Right? To me, that mobilization is key.
Key. It's crucial. Right? That is the mobilization that was absent in the Obama era.
Well, of course, right? So it just never. But to me, this is the new power.
Yes.
That is really changing party dynamics. And we have to husband it in the most careful way if we are going to have that base, that momentum to carry us forward.
I appreciate that. And of course, this is another way of paying homage to Sanders, who was the first to make a case for the centrality of the participation of the people themselves. The Jamesian scholar, of course, we are very respectful about transforming consciousness through the activities of the exploited themselves, as opposed to the activities of those organic or disorganic who claim to represent them. I think Sanders made this compelling case, and it is that compelling case you are contending is going to be central in the fabrication and cultivation of the new party. And when you speak about the new party, I can't help but think of Fanon, who in The Rights of the Earth fought exactly for that. Turning a new leaf meant for him cultivating a people's party, a radically new party. That is a party precisely because the people are part and parcel of it. Remarkable. And now we go to Neil Roberts. Neil, I have to scold myself for not summarizing as well as I should have done all these brilliant books that you're writing. Why don't we begin your participation by you listing the books that you have published and summarizing for us what their content is, and then we'll return to the subject matter at hand. I just feel guilty for not doing work and summarizing the content of these books. My apologies.
No, please. First of all, thank you, Theodos, and also Paget, to kind of be with you both and the viewers. And I have to say, before doing that listening to Paget, where Paget ended, in terms of thinking about the refashioning of not only the distinction between liberalism and neoliberalism, but also the refashioning of the party. I think it's important that Clinton refashioned the Democratic Party and called themselves the New Democrats. I mean, it wasn't that specifically used that term. So Fanon, as Professor Quiros has said, had a certain sense of a new humanity, but there's also ways in which the lexicon of newness, the vocabulary, can also be a form of retrenchment. And so kind of with that, in terms of thinking about just some of the, kind of briefly talking about some of the books that I've published and also I'm finishing up, one that you had mentioned, which I'll come back to momentarily, is Freedom as Marronage, which was an attempt to articulate one of the two ideas I want to talk about today, which is the idea of freedom. What do we mean? And particularly, I try to ask in the book, how is it that so many discussions of freedom in the modern period in particular, though not exclusively, have done so without trying to reconcile the relationship between freedom and slavery. And so I'll say a little bit momentarily about what the essence of that meant. But in many ways, that book was thinking through how do we get free, right? How do we actually get free, particularly from the vantage point of those who are living an unfree existence. Around that same time, I completed a collaborative work with my colleague Jane Anna Gordon called Creolizing Rousseau, which launched a series, a collaboration between the Caribbean Philosophical Association and the publisher Rowman and Littlefield International, which is thinking about the idea of creolization, which is not merely what some scholars call syncretism. It's not merely the mixing two things together. So if we think of a blender, I don't know if you all like, in terms of like different drinks, if you have a kind of a blender, when people think of a blender syncretism, they think of putting something into a blender, two fixed elements, you put it in, you blend it, and then you get some third fixed elements. That's mixture. That's what the French call métissage, or but creolization is what happens when two or more elements, or for us, two or more ideas, or two or more individuals and movements come together. What is not only generated, but what novelty comes out of that? And also, how do things continue to change as a result? So in many regards, Creolizing Rousseau was looking at one of the thinkers in the social contract tradition that, as Charles Mills said, was the anti-contractarian contractarian, someone for whom he was looking at Europe and the class distinction between the rich and the poor, and then trying to think out how can one say one lives in a free society when there's such inequality. And speaking of political economy, in many regards, figures like Thomas Piketty today, in some sense, are trying to kind of take that up. But we're also looking at the ways in which, also like Piketty, that discourse has really put, speaking of the center, put Europe at the center. And how in many regards, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Bell Hooks talk about, how can we have a moving center, right? Or to think of the Caribbean Philosophical Association shifting the geography of reason as the motto. How do we actually think both with and against an important thinker who raised many questions that have been taken up, in our view, and in mine, in the Caribbean philosophical and intellectual and political traditions. And then one work was also a collaborative, which was a homage to our other guest, Paget Henry, Journeys in Caribbean Thought, which was trying to think through and make accessible for the first time in one space an introduction to the different works of Paget Henry. And what was fascinating about that project is we had our list of what we thought were Paget's most important work, and then Paget had his list of what he thought was his most important works. And out of that, in and of itself, was a journey, because there are many regards, and I know, Paget, you remember this, in many regards, a lot of times he mentioned a lot of book reviews that he wrote, review essays, these long review essays, not about famous people, by famous people yet, but about emerging scholars, you know, people in communities and spaces who are writing brilliant work, but maybe the world, for various reasons, had not yet tapped into what she or he has done. And so out of that kind of collaboration, really brought me full circle to the book that I'm finishing now, about to publish, which is called, tentatively, How to Live Free in an Age of Pessimism. So there's not just in Black studies, but also in the world that we are living, COVID-19, as Paget mentioned, whether we call it an insurrection or there's something, other terms, anti-Black racism, the movement for Black lives. What I wrestle with in this book, latest book, is not merely how do we get free, but how do we live free? An emphasis on living, right? Of life and living. And pessimisms, those who embrace different forms of pessimism aren't necessarily saying that another world isn't possible. They're just raising the question that maybe it might not ever materialize the way that we might hope. And I try and actually look into what is that, what are those concerns? What are the reasons why people might have that demeanor? And yet at the same time, say, well, actually, I think that if we look at history actually proves, in my view, that in those moments when we would have every reason to be pessimistic about future outlooks, our future, that actually people, and particularly Black people, or people who've been racialized as Black in the modern period, not only resisted, but also created, and also built, and also rebuilt, right, in the face of ongoing acts to dehumanize their inherent humanity. And in the midst of all that, still have been trying to figure out how to live. How is it that if we look at the different insurrections and uprisings now, you're having Black and brown people, and Black people in particular, being the most adversely affected, not just in terms of infections, but of deaths, right, in COVID-19. And yet at the same time, these individuals, and also, as Paget mentioned, which is stark, the alliances, the solidarities, right, Black-white solidarities, and also other non-Black peoples of color for whom have been arguing and putting their lives at risk amidst a public health pandemic, that even in the face of something that is lethal, they've been willing to go to the streets, tear down the monuments, try and make demands. And as Frederick Douglass said in 1857, right, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never, right, it never has, and it never will. And so I'll stop there. But really, what I hopefully can talk about more is not only what Maranize means and what it can mean with regards to freedom, but also maybe later in our discussion, power. Essentially, I think we need to have we need to return to the meaning of power. We need to embrace power and also address the ways that power has been bastardized by people in particular positions of authority.
Thank you. Paget Henry, Back to you. Please engage Neil Roberts. You might want to respond to the way in which he is complementing your project, and then link it to the second dimension of the discussion of vision. The first dimension being the imperativeness of developing and cultivating a new party, a newness of which is going to be propelled by a sustained participation of the interracial and intercultural coalitions that are taking place globally to inform and give data to this Fanonist new party. I want to pay homage to Fanon again. So that is one dimension. The second dimension is the economic dimension, which is a continuation of your penetrating critique of the vacuousness of the neoliberal project, the financialization, the pseudo-globalization that you carefully articulated in the episode prior to that. And now what I and you, I think, have called radical liberalism is going to have a radically different interpretation of the creation of values, for example, and the ways commodities have been getting produced. And the call for the new party is going to introduce us to a different kind of relationships with commodities themselves, most particularly liberating human beings from becoming commodity-like and getting thrown on the streets now, as people are contending, because some of them cannot pay rent. That's the ultimate alienation that the human as a human could possibly suffer. And this new political party that you're calling for is going to arm us with a new relationship with the production of values that would make it impossible for human beings not to be able to live in their homes only because they cannot afford to pay rents for them. So this, I think, is part of your new vision.
Sure. Okay. I really want to congratulate Neil for taking up in the way that he's doing the challenge of dealing with Afro-pessimism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's something that I have sort of avoided in my work, because ultimately I think that at bottom I find there that a very unrealistic view of what it means to struggle. It's as though they want to make a move against the state or against a ruling class and not experience a pushback. Right? That once you make a move that's agonistic, you have to be prepared, right, for the counter moves, right? And that's why I began by saying, let us be aware of what is our strength in this moment, right? You don't want to go beyond your strength. Make an agonistic move against, an enemy who has more power than you at this moment, right? Because once you make an agonistic move, you have shifted to the strategic level. It's no longer a battle of ideas. It's also a power battle. And I find with a lot of the Afro-pessimists, it's as though they wanted it to be just so easy. I just thought they had this unrealistic view, right, of how ruling classes, privileged groups resist. And I just, haven't had the time to really sit around and say, look, guys, let me tell you once again about how ruling classes cling to power. I just felt it was something they should know, and it's something they will discover. So, so really, kudos to you for taking the time, the effort, and in particular, the very, very, I thought, careful manner, very respectful manner in which you have been dealing with some of the Afro-pessimists. You know, again, for those Afro-pessimists who embrace the death instinct,
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying you got two instincts: the life instinct and the death instinct. Why are you going to embrace the death instinct?
Mm-hmm.
You know, death is a part of life. The more powerful instinct has to be the life instinct. All right? That just seems so obvious to me. So some of these things, I just didn't have the patience to sit and make arguments about. So really, you know, I really like the way in which you've been taking on some of these arguments very patiently, very respectfully, and dealing with them. So, you know, I really wanted to say kudos to you for doing that. You know.
And so on that point, and I really appreciate your words, Paget. And maybe Theodorus, this might give your viewers a little bit of background in terms of, well, what is Marronage in the first place, and how does that address, in a respectful manner, as Paget said, not only my concerns with the status of Afro-pessimism today, but also how maybe freedom relates to power. So historically, a word came into being, marronage. It's a French word. It's spelled a few different ways, but I tend to spell it M-A-R-R-O-N-A-G-E. It's a French noun that translates as flight, the word flight. Initially, marronage referred to Spanish feral cattle fleeing from on the island of Hispaniola, what is contemporary Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So cattle that then left plantations and then went up into the mountains. And then subsequently it referred to enslaved indigenous populations, or Amerindians, who then took flight from New World slave plantations into the mountains. And then approximately by the 1530s to enslaved Africans who then were trying to flee plantation slavery. And so historically, there are two types of marronage, both in the moment in which the term came into being and how it was used in treaties, and then also in many contemporary vocabularies. The one, petit marronage, which just means little marronage, or short flight. So this referred to individuals such as runaway slaves. Speaking of Frederick Douglass, you know, thinking about someone who either kind of took flight for an hour or several hours from a plantation, either for mental sustenance or to see a loved one on another plantation, or for organizing, trying to then organize a form of either escape or rebellion with a slave or slaves in another plantation. To those who might just have tried to leave altogether. And then the second type, grand marronage, G-R-A-N-D, which is large. So individuals and groups that thought either in his lifetime, or maybe never, that the regime of slavery, and particularly racial slavery, would never be obliterated. So what was the next best thing? Well, try and within the territory of a state, a nation state, how does one then carve up their own isolationist community, oftentimes in the hills and then in the swamps? And I really want to say this because there is a mythos, particularly in the United States, that whatever marronage was historically or is, it happened in the Caribbean, it happened in Latin America, which it did, it happened in Southeast Asia, which it did, but it happened also in the United States, as well. It's very important. I also think it's really interesting that when one talks about Harriet Beecher Stowe, right, and the text that people think of and the figure is Uncle Tom, right, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But because of the pushback, speaking of 19th century liberalism, going back to Paget's point, because of the representation of a certain form of acquiescent liberal politics that many readers had with Harriet Beecher Stowe, she published another novel that most people don't read called Dread, which is the story of a fugitive slave who spends a lot of time in the swamps, in the Great Dismal Swamp in the South, and then eventually, right, tries to escape. That's all well and good. But people say, well, Neil, you know, this Maranaj stuff is really a qualified freedom, because we know also historically that the vast majority of Grand Maranaj communities ultimately signed treaties with colonial powers, essentially saying we will no longer, colonial powers saying we will no longer try and invade and take over your territory so long as you turn over any new runaway slaves. So between the Haitian Revolution in 1804 that ends in 1804 and the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the one Caribbean territory that almost had a social and political revolution, my home country of Jamaica, was killed in 1865 in the Moran Bay Rebellion because Maroons turned over one of the two main leaders of the rebellion, and then the rebellion became killed. However, here's what I want to leave everyone with on this point. I am inviting everyone to imagine, what if we were to think about freedom, not merely in the New World Atlantic modern period, but prior to, and then what is now called Afrofuturism into the future, you know, in a time that's not even now. What if we were to think about freedom as flight from different forms of enslavement that can factor in not only our individuals by themselves, the so-called modern American, kind of the individualist kind of ethos, or those Grand Maranaj communities, but also for those who are interested in transforming the social and political order, either from the top down, what I call sovereign Maranaj, essentially, whether it's through a deity or deities or a political leader who thinks, this is the only time you'll ever hear me say trickle down. Ronald Reagan had the idea of trickle down economics. I call sovereign Maranaj trickle down freedom. The idea that our freedom, each of us, you, all of us watching, our freedom is through some sovereign entity, and then it spreads to a mass. And ultimately, I say sovereign Maranaj collapses into a form of dictatorship. So when Paget is talking about not only the resurgence, and we could focus on the US, but we see this all, the most recent Belarus, what has happened just recently with Belarus, right? You have a kind of an authoritarian who, in terms of the elections, refuses to give up the elections. I think the numbers an issue where he locked up 7,000 plus intellectuals all across Belarus. This idea that, right, some type of figure, that freedom goes down through them, and through that they then consolidate power so that any attempt to question it then can ultimately lead into something dangerous. But what I've been particularly interested in is, speaking of Fanon and drawing upon Fanon, is sociogenic Maranaj, the idea of freedom from the ground up, where social collectives, whether decentralized or in different types of forms of collective action as well, try and refashion the entire social political order, which is not a naive displacement of party politics that assumes that a new state might not have a president or a prime minister or some other type of leader, but it is an attempt to suggest, as C.L.R. James said in his pamphlet, "Every Cook Can Govern," that all of us have a possibility of contributing to the demos, to the refashioning of the society. And ultimately, I argue that, not in the book, but now, that what we are witnessing, the insurrection that Paget's talking about, I call that, what's going on is a global Maranaj. What is happening is that all across, sparked with the catalyst of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among others, but that was those were the kind of the catalysts for this national reckoning, but also, as we see with the statues that Paget opened with, the bringing down of statues, and also the different social movements going on now, this global Maranaj is occurring, and fundamentally, one then says, well, how does this speak? Because now this gets to neoliberalism and liberalism. How does this understanding of Maranaj, is it anti-Western? And I make the argument that it's not. I say Maranaj is not anti-Western, it's post-Western. So what do I mean? Arguably, there are two streams, or rather ways of thinking about freedom, ancient and modern, in Western thought. The first I call negative and positive. These are not ethical. I don't mean negative and positive meaning you're a good or a bad person. I mean negative, such as notions of freedom as non-interference and non-domination. Different ideas of freedom that are about how can one not have another individual or group or state encroaching on oneself. We see this come into being with Thomas Hobbes, with his book Leviathan. We see it all the way with figures like Kant and Isaiah Berlin. But the connection, and maybe Paget and I might have a different view of the relationship between liberalism and neoliberalism. But I actually suggest that neoliberalism is a kind of a mutation of this liberal idea that Hobbes brought into being of freedom as non-interference. And if one looks at the Austrian school of political economy, particularly figures like Friedrich Hayek and others, that what they do in the 20th century is they tweak it and suggest that individual freedom is about non-interference by the state into the lives of individuals, such that the Austrian school of political economy says, well, the individual needs to be free. And what that means is we need to embrace the free market. We need to embrace personal choice. We need to embrace the idea that the state is a coercive agent and allow people in the market to thrive. One view, negative non-interference. I also think there's a stream of thinking of freedom as non-domination on the one hand. So these two negative ideas. Then positive notions of freedom, such as autonomy and plurality. They talk much about what type of world do we want to live in, our constitution, what type of order, what is the social and political order we want, the vision we want to live in, but they tell us very little about the world that we want to exit. And so putting these two ideas together, what I'm suggesting is that the negative streams of thinking as freedom as non-interference and non-domination on the one hand, and freedom as these positive conceptions of freedom on the other, both connect over the idea that whatever freedom and unfreedom are, that they're static and that they're forever unchanging. And Marinage allows us to say, well, how can we actually put this together? That Marinage actually involves, as we're seeing with the movement for Black Lives currently, that it is involved with not only thinking about what type, not only questions of non-domination and non-interference on the one hand, that's the resistance part, but it's also about, as we see with the pillars, the demands that Paget was getting us to, the demands that different activists are making, not only with regards to party politics, but also extra party politics, the demands that are being made, the cross-racial alliances. So if one looks at Oregon, what's fascinating about Oregon is if one looks at the movement for Black Lives upright and the different insurrections, a lot of them are predominantly non-Black peoples, but they're still connected with regards to this dynamic of how not only do we kind of resist and try and get away from the world that we don't want, but how do we actually build and think about the world that we do? And ultimately, my last point is this question of power. Power, in my view, is very much in the air. It's on the streets. It's coalescing around the monuments. It's percolating in the movement for Black Lives. We see it in our responses to the COVID-19 public health pandemic, but it also never disappeared among elites dedicated to the maintenance of racial hierarchy and injustices at the expense of freedom. And so one of the pieces I just finished up called Afterlives of the Slave Power is saying, if we want an example of a moment that I think all of us should go back to, and we've really missed, is the decade of the 1850s. In the United States, it wasn't just academics, but something that was in general parlance, a term that was called the slave power, capital S, capital P. You can look at the newspapers, people talking about it, people writing about it. And the idea of the slave power, which was discredited in the early 20th century, I think for bad reasons, was this idea right in the decade before the outbreak of the Civil War, which was the notion that at the time, in a kind of a slave society, that there was an oligarchical group of Southern planters who weren't simply upholding slavery in the South, but they had an asymmetric influence over politicians, organizations, and individuals in the North as well. And they were committed not only to maintaining slavery in what would become the Confederacy, but also they were dedicated to the upholding of white supremacy and racial segregation in the North. In addition, we have to remember that in 1787, when the US forged its constitutional convention, one of the compromises in the convention was the 3/5 compromise, right? Because in the original US Constitution, slavery is never written in the Constitution, but the 3/5 clause was, which said the following. It said that even though the population of the South, if one excluded the slave population, Southerners were worried about their representations in Congress and also in the Supreme Court, but especially Congress, the House of Representatives. And the 3/5 clause then allowed for all slaves to be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation on the one hand, but also for the purposes of every 10 years, the reallocation of members of seats of each state in the House of Representatives. And because of that, the South was asymmetrically overrepresented in Congress. And people like Frederick Douglass, those who had become suffragettes after the end of the Civil War, there were many who were concerned that this slave power, that now I'm going to call what it was, white power, right? A white power elite was running this country and having everyone as puppets. And even in the North, no one, the worry was who's even standing up to this white power. And the question becomes, and Du Bois, even though he meditated less on the slave power than someone like Douglass did, that concern in Black Reconstruction, when Du Bois is trying to figure out, was it simply white abolitionists in the North who then really were the catalyst for the Civil War rather than fugitive slaves and Black slaves, etc. But it's deeper. It's this question of the challenge of power, and not merely looking at power as a negative attribute, but saying that there's a small oligarchy that has consolidated power, and particularly a white supremacist oligarchy that is running the country. And how can power be taken back? Not avoided, but how can power be taken back for the purposes of an egalitarian and free society? And I believe, my last sentence here, is that what we need to think about now, and that lesson that we didn't learn about the slave power, is that I think we see this. The occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is really the biggest example of that there is an individual, but it is a larger kind of network. And these insurrections are in many regards, and the global marronage around the world are really insurrections against certain forms of elite forms of power, but certainly in the US context. And we have to ask ourselves whether that's the Democratic Party trying to make it a rethinking of what liberalism means and a rejection of the neoliberal project on the one hand, but also in general, what are we fighting for? What are we struggling for? And how can we make power not a dirty word? That we saw, speaking of Clinton, we saw this in the John Lewis funeral, right? Out of the blue, who comes up? Stokely Carmichael. Right? Stokely comes up. Clinton takes this kind of jab at Stokely Carmichael because this idea of Black power was something to be feared. And what Stokely was saying is, why is it fearful to simply say that Black people want equal access to food? Black people want the equal access to jobs. Black people want to not be the object of day-to-day racial violence. And is it so wrong to advocate for a certain conception of power? So I think freedom and power, I would invite us, even if many of you disagree or even here disagree with how I see those relations, that we need to have a rethinking of the relationship between freedom and power that I think will filter into a lot of Paget's extremely profound commentary on not only how do we understand neoliberalism, but in a reconstructive project amidst these insurrections, not only what are we fighting for, but how might we actually not merely talking about getting free, but living. That's what Afro-pessimists cannot get, right? They're focusing so much on the death. Well, Paget's saying the death drive, that can we focus on the life drive and how that life drive, and not merely social death, as Orlando Patterson would say, but marronage. How do we actually kind of think about, even as thorny as it is, how we can not only get free and live free, and how the embracing of power is not a dirty word, but can actually really be about the refashioning of the very nature of democracy itself.
Okay. In the first hour, to the great benefit of my viewers, these two were great thinkers, have produced the first component of the vision, in which Paget Henry, quite appropriately, demanded rather, the cultivation of a new political party. And his co-thinker, Neil Roberts, joins forces with them and shares with them how it is that this idea of marronage, which is a way of inviting the people in concert to develop a new relationship with power, in which power for the first time could be conceived not as domination, but as caring, as sharing, as living with the other, compassionately, generously, lovingly, patiently, and advocate for the germination and development of possibilities for the human condition. And now we move on to think through the second equally central component of the political demand for the cultivation of a political party, namely the question, what is the economic content, the material content of that new political party going to be? Take it on, Professor Paget Henry.
Okay, sure. Just a few brief comments on you. Now, I thought it was interesting that people have commented so extensively on Clinton's reference to Stokely Carmichael. People tend to forget that, it's not just simply the idea that, African Americans should have certain basic rights and so forth that Stokely was talking about. Remember, when Stokely won the election to be the chair of SNCC, right? The organization was going through this very, very, very profound transformation. They were deciding whether or not there should be any whites in the organization. Stokely was making the argument that they should not be. That this is a time for African Americans to get together and decide their own future, what they want to do. They needed to go through this separatist phase and things like that. While John was very, very strongly opposed to that. So it was a very, very important moment in the life of SNCC. And the very emergence of a confident, assertive Black identity, I thought grew out of that act of separation. And so when I see it happening now with women, and Black women in particular, this need to separate themselves from what Black men are doing or from what men in general are doing, I think it's something similar. And I think there's an important lesson there to be learned about phases in identity formation after long periods of oppression. That need to separate, to regroup, refashion yourself on your own terms, and then come back. That was a big part of what Stokely was talking about. And so John, I thought was a little, it didn't quite fit with his doctrine of love and turning the other cheek and that sort of stuff. That moment of pushing the other away, I thought he had a little trouble with. But Stokely was saying it was very necessary. So I thought it was important to clear that up. And I bring it up because, I was so close to it. This is the time when I was on the ground in all of these organizations, SNCC, CORE, Urban League, all of them. So I just thought I would, just inject something very concrete, something very specific on that. Okay, on to the economic issue. Now, when we're talking about transformation, I always gauge the alternative vision by, again, the power base that we have. And we can, lay out ideal conceptions of freedom. Human beings have been doing this from time immemorial, but realizing them has not been easy. And it's either one, you don't have the power needed to realize your ideal, or two, you've underestimated the power of the opposition. And so in this moment, what kind of economic changes, what kind of economic reforms we should push for, I think become even more of a strategic phenomenon than in the case of the political. I say that because it is easier to pressure political parties than it is to pressure corporations, right? That political parties, especially if they are mass-based or electorally based, are quite sensitive to mass action, mass pressure, and so forth. Changing corporations is quite different. It's questions of technology, profitability, et cetera, enter the picture. Now, when we look at Black attempts at economic reform, the record has not been a very good one. It's not that there's a shortage of ideas. It's really the power to match these ideas. So if we look at the history of Black struggle, let's say in the US or even in the Caribbean, several approaches have been suggested. We've had reparations from day one. Very early, the argument that African Americans, Africans in the New World in general, have really suffered serious crimes against humanity, right? And that legally, by international law, reparations are due. That this has been a long-standing argument, and it goes on right to this very moment. The center of it is now in the Caribbean, but at one point the center was here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen this back and forth with the reparations argument, how it circulates throughout the Africana world with different centers at various times. So this is a persistent response. And of course, measuring the reparations, what would be their nature, et cetera, have varied, but nonetheless, it has been a persistent way of responding to the economic devastation African Americans have suffered. Second, the idea of a Marshall Plan for Black America, the Caribbean, Africa. That this is an idea that has circulated as much as the idea of reparations. So Whitney Young, right, of the National Urban League, here in the United States, probably the leading advocate of this as a response to the economic situation that African Americans inherited as a result of slavery and Jim Crow. I can't remember the exact figure that Whitney Young had in mind. I think it was something like $150 billion or something like that. And he really wanted it to go to the economic transformation of African American communities. Then, of course, we've had affirmative action, and affirmative action being kind of a mild version of a reparations and a Marshall Plan. Because if you look at it, you are going to have the federal government intervening, right, with job training. It's going to monitor practices of job discrimination against African Americans, right? And the whole idea was to try and compensate African Americans for centuries of economic exclusion. So this is like a mild version that combines the idea of reparations with some form of a Marshall Plan. And the Johnson administration, I think, came the closest to putting together something like that, right? Then, of course, we had, the Reagan administration with, it's got to be, you just got to throw you guys to the free market. Just believe in the free market. It's colorblind now. We're not going to discriminate against you anymore. All this history of redlining, the fact that Black homes don't appreciate at the same rate and accumulate equity at the same rate of white. Oh, forget about all of that. We have restored the markets. Just trust in the market and everything will be just fine, right? That's one solution. And before Reagan, we had Nixon's Black capitalism, which basically, before there was the Grameen Bank, that guy in Bangladesh who developed this idea of microfinancing. I haven't checked it out, but I suspect that he might have gotten this idea from Nixon's Black capitalism, that it's a kind of a microfinancing model of economic development that Nixon developed with this term Black capitalism.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes left, and I would like Neil Roberts to respond to what Paget has so ably articulated, a respectful call for reparations to be given a due attention, synthesized with a call for something like a Marshall Plan that vindicated Europe from the abyss of destruction. He's asking that we can reasonably consider the possibility of marshalling Marshall Plan to salvage and actually develop decapitated housings and educational non-experiences for African Americans. He has so ably developed these two concretely as interventions that the new political party could take under the tutelage of the Biden and Harris regime and effectively, so that we can begin to see lineaments of a new America, unharassed by race, but attentive to race.
Yes.
Unnecessarily pessimistic, but reasonably optimistic. optimistic. I think the outline that Paget has given is quite concrete. Yes, please.
I just want to add one option out there that should be mentioned here that I didn't get to complete, and that is, of course, Black socialism. That has been on the agenda, so I just want to make sure that I included it.
Yep. So in response, I think Paget Henry is making very powerful and persuasive arguments. You know, let's take a step back about what defines a reparations claim. You know, arguably there are two principles that define reparations for historical injustices. The first is a public apology from a party or parties considered the individuals who are the ones who implemented an injustice on an individual or group. Public apology. That can be an individual, organization, or states. The second is oftentimes this gets reduced to money, but what I would call the kind of rectification principle, meaning after an apology for a historical injustice, what you open with Lenin, you know, the kind of the what must be done. This is the principle of, are we talking about monetary, right? Are we talking about programs, structural, right, long-term? Are we talking about a combination of all of those things? And as Paget beautifully laid out, much of the discourse has been recently focused on, especially when talking about reparation for slavery and the slave trade, has been among kind of the United States, North America, but increasingly has been among Caribbean politicians and intellectuals and everyday people. And so that's the first thing in terms of what are the claims. We have to also think about, speaking of the Caribbean, someone who had a volte-face on this issue, Frantz Fanon. In Fanon's first main work, Black Skin, White Mask, which was published in 1952, if we recall, Fanon ends the book by rejecting different claims for historical injustices. As he says, I don't want to be the slave to the slavery, capital S, of my ancestors, and has a very ambiguous view in terms of how should the future look and the status of reparations in it. By Les Dames de la Terre, before Fanon dies of leukemia, he says in that long first chapter on violence, and particularly on violence in the international context, he's looking at the world in the wake of the Second World War. He's looking at different reparations for historical injustices that happen as a result of that. And he does two things. He says, yes, there should be a monetary dimension to reparations claims that now he argues should happen. That's in 1961. But he says there also should be long-term structural dimensions to that. This question about not only reparations for historical injustice, but how does that connect to not only these uprisings, the moment dimension of uprisings, and the long-term movement and sustainability of change in the different models. I mean, I want to just add a particular debate. And the New York Times was one of the organizations that covered this, though the article, it sounds like, misrepresented some of the details. But the Democratic Socialists of America had a very important meeting recently in which Adolph Reed, kind of a well-known figure in Black politics, Black political thought, labor organizer, but also someone who has pushed, and a socialist, right, who has pushed back over the years, over the decades rather, that what needs to happen not only to Black people, but also the disenfranchised is, in his view, this kind of sense in which race is so somehow over-determinant on Black futures, rather than thinking about class as the main element. And then some such as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who is not a former member of the DSA, but who was at least on record as then saying, people like Adolph Reed Jr., who are saying, what needs to happen now? Because I think, Teodros, that's what you're asking, what needs to happen now? Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor says, look at COVID-19, look at a lot of these other, look at not just merely redlining, as Paget talked about, but Yamahtta Taylor's most recent book was on the kind of the housing industry, the history, the markets, the ways in which they're long-term at the structural level, ways in which Black people were disadvantaged because of long-standing policies. And she's saying, how can we then talk about what needs to happen, whether it's a Marshall Plan for the future, for the 21st century, that does not take into account race, not subordinating class, but that these need to go together. And I think that's why my last point is that in terms of thinking about socialism, and also I would add figures such as the late great Arthur Lewis, versions of kind of Fabian socialism as certain models. the New World group that was in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in the Caribbean. Discussions of Isabel Wilkerson has a kind of a new book, right, on caste. Just like this last point. Just let me finish last on caste. On caste, I promise, last point on caste, but this is very important because people are saying, wait a minute, caste was discussed in South Asia, for instance, in other areas, but what Wilkerson has not talked about is the ways in which early in the 20th century, particularly of Trinidad tradition, figures like Oliver Cromwell Cox, right, his book on kind of caste, class, right, and race, where he was trying to think about, it's not an either or, but is how do these things come together if there is going to be a 21st century Marshall Plan. I would say that we have to consider all of these, and that reparations for historical injustice is not the sole issue, is not the sole policy that needs to happen, but is one we should take seriously along with negotiating these differing factors.
Fantastic. I would like to give the last 3 minutes to the great Paget Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I just think that, one has to look at how much power you have in terms of changing an economic order. I think right now, the neoliberal order is very vulnerable, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have companies like Facebook, Google, et cetera, that are mighty, powerful, can act back and resist. So, question is, what do we do? To me, I come back to the very, very unique monetary environment that the United States, England, the EU, and Japan are in at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
These countries have been, at the moment, blessed in a way. They have the capacity to just print money, and it does not produce inflation. We don't know how much longer they can continue to do this, right? But what I think we need to really focus in on is the idea that this capacity is being used to backstop Wall Street. The crisis, as we've seen, the federal government was able, or I should say the Federal Reserve Bank, was able to print $3.1 trillion. It didn't exist before, right? And they're getting ready now to print some more. And this capacity is not going to last forever.
2 more minutes left.
The question is this the time for us to talk about a serious Marshall Plan for Black America? We need to think of a broad, take this money, and democratically we need to decide what it is we want to do. I think we should have like an investment plan for America. Think of the many white people caught in this opioid addiction. They are not doing too well. They need help, right? This is the white working class suffering, right? And so we really need to take a moment out and say, what do we really want to do with this unique and special financial moment? Shouldn't we put it out there and have some kind of extensive democratic debate of what we want to do over, let's say, the next 5 years, where the federal government can create trillions of dollars, right? What do we want to do with that money? And I'm saying, whether we say it's a Green New Deal, whether we say it's infrastructure, this is the time for us to lobby heavily for a Marshall Plan for Black America.
Thank you dearly. Neil Roberts, I would be more than happy to give you a minute.
Yes, I would say that if one goes back to that famous document,
1 minute.
Yep, by the Combahee River Collective, Black Feminist Statement, in which the co-authors said that when Black people get free, we all get free. and I think that is and live free. I think that is right. So in this call for a Marshall Plan, not only for Black America, but also for those who have still had the aftershocks of not only slavery and the slave trade, that what this means is a call for us to reorient our thinking around political economy. We've talked a lot in these episodes and others about philosophy, political theory, politics, but also political economy, the economic infrastructure that affects us all. And with that, I think it'll allow us to really do the work. As Paget said, not merely the defining the ideal, but realizing it.
Remarkable. African Ascent is truly grateful for these two major thinkers to have graced us with their presence, with a tantalizing and meaningful 1.5 hour discourse. As Neil Roberts suggested towards the end, I promised to invite the two of you again to exclusively focus on discourses on political economy, through which Paget Henry in his early work and now made himself appropriately famous. This is your host, Theodros Kiros, for African Ascent.